Otto of the Silver Hand. Chapter 12. A Ride for Life. But not yet was Otto safe, and all the danger past and gone by. Suddenly, as they stood there, the harsh clangor of a bell broke the silence of the starry night above their heads, and as they raised their faces and looked up, they saw lights flashing from window to window. Presently came the sound of a hoarse voice shouting something that, from the distance, they could not understand. One-eyed Hans smote his hand upon his thigh. "Look," said he, "here is what comes of having a soft heart in one's bosom. I overcame and bound a watchman up yonder, and forced him to tell me where our young baron lay. It was on my mind to run my knife into him, after he had told me everything. But then, bethinking how the young baron hated the thought of bloodshed, I said to myself, 'No, Hans, I will spare the villain's life.' So now, what comes of being merciful? Here, by hook or by crook, the fellow has loosened himself from his bonds, and brings the whole castle about our ears like a nest of wasps." "We must fly," said the baron, "for nothing else in the world is left me. Now that all have deserted me in this black time of trouble, excepting these 6 faithful ones." His voice was bitter, bitter as he spoke. Then, stooping, he raised Otto in his arms, and bearing him gently, began rapidly descending the rocky slope to the level road that ran along the edge of the hill beneath. Close behind him followed the rest, Hans still grimed with soot and in his bare feet. A little distance from the road and under the shade of a forest tree, 7 horses stood waiting. The baron mounted upon his great black charger, seating little Otto upon the saddle in front of him. "Forward," he cried, and away they clattered, and out upon the road. Then, "To St. Michaelsburg," said Baron Conrad in his deep voice, and the horses' heads were turned to the westward, and away they galloped through the black shadows of the forest, leaving Trutstraken behind them. But still the sound of the alarm bell rang through the beating of the horses' hoofs, and as Hans looked over his shoulder, he saw the light of the torches flashing hither and thither along the outer walls in front of the great Barbican. In the castle Trutstraken all was confusion and uproar. Flashing torches lit up the dull gray walls, horses neighed and stamped, and men shouted and called to one another in the bustle of making ready. Presently Baron Henry came striding along the corridor, clad in light armor, which he had hastily donned when roused from his sleep by the news that his prisoner had escaped. Below, in the courtyard, his horses were standing, and without waiting for assistance, he swung himself into the saddle. Then away they all rode, and down the steep path, armor ringing, swords clanking, and iron-shod hoofs striking sparks of fire from the hard stones. At their head rode Baron Henry. His triangular shield hung over his shoulder, and in his hand he bore a long, heavy, steel-pointed lance with a pennant flickering darkly from the end. At the high road at the base of the slope they paused, for they were at a loss to know which direction the fugitives had taken. A half-score of retainers leapt from their horses and began hurrying about, hither and thither, up and down, like hounds searching for the lost scent. And all the time Baron Henry sat still at a rock in the midst of the confusion. Suddenly a shout was raised from the forest just beyond the road. They had come upon the place where the horses had been tied, and it was as easy a matter to trace the way that Baron Conrad and his followers had taken, hence back to the right high road. But there again they were at a loss. The road ran straight as an arrow eastward and westward. Had the fugitives taken their way to the east or to the west? Baron Henry called his head man Nicholas Stein to him, and the two spoke together for a while in an undertone. At last the baron's lieutenant reined his horse back, and choosing first one and then another, divided the company in two parties. The baron placed himself at the head of one band, and Nicholas Stein at the head of the other. "Forward!" he cried, and away clattered the two companies of horsemen in opposite directions. It was towards the westward that Baron Henry of Trutz-Drachen rode at the head of his men. The early springtide sun shot its rays of misty yellow light across the rolling tops of the forest trees, where the little birds were singing in the glory of the May morning. But Baron Henry and his followers thought nothing of the beauty of the peaceful day, and heard nothing of the multitudinous sounds of the singing birds, as with a confused sound of galloping hoofs they swept along the highway, leaving behind them a slow curling, low trailing cloud of dust. As the sun rose more full and warm, the misty wreaths began to dissolve, until at last they parted and rolled asunder like a white curtain, and there before the pursuing horsemen lay the crest of the mountain towards which they were riding, and up which the road wound steeply. "Yonder they are!" cried a sudden voice behind Baron Henry of Trutz-Drachen, and at that cry all looked upward. Far away upon the mountain side curled a cloud of dust, from the midst of which came the star-like flash of varnished armor and gleaming in the sun. Baron Henry said nothing and never a word, but his lips curled in a grim smile. And as the mist wreaths parted, one-eyed Hans looked behind and down into the leafy valley beneath. "Yonder they come," said he, "and they have followed sharply to gain so much upon us. Even though our horses are wearied with all the travelling we have done hither and yon these 5 past days. How far is it, Lord Baron, from here to Michaelsburg?" "About 10 leagues," said the baron in a gloomy voice. Hans puckered his mouth as though to whistle, but the baron saw nothing of it, for he was gazing straight before him with a set and a stony face. Those who followed him looked at one another, and the same thought was in the mind of each. How long would it be before those who pursued would close the distance between them? When that happened, it meant death to one and to all. They reached the crest of the hill, and down they dashed upon the other side, for there the road was smooth and level, as it sloped away into the valley. But it was in dead silence that they rode. Now and then those who followed the baron looked back over their shoulders. They had gained a mile upon their pursuers when the helmeted heads rose above the crest of the mountain. But what was the gain of a mile with a smooth road between them and fresh horses to weary ones? On they rode, and on they rode. The sun rose higher and higher and hotter and hotter. There was no time to rest and water their panting horses. Only once, when they crossed a shallow stretch of water, the poor animals bent their heads and caught a little gulp from the cool stream, and one-eyed Hans washed a part of the soot from his hands and face. On and on they rode. Never once did the Baron Conrad move his head or alter his steadfast look, as, gazing straight before him, he rode steadily forward along the endless stretch of road, with poor little Otto's yellow head and white face resting against his steel-clad shoulder, and St. Michaelsburg still 8 leagues away. A little rise of ground lay before them, and as they climbed it, all excepting the baron, turned their heads, as with one accord, and looked behind them. Then more than one heart failed, for through the leaves of the trees below they caught the glint of armor of those who followed, not more than a mile away. The next moment they swept over the crest, and there, below them, lay the broad shining river, and nearer a tributary stream spanned by a rude, narrow, three-arched stone bridge where the road crossed the deep, slow-moving water. Down the slope plodded the weary horses, and so to the bridge headed. "Halt!" cried the Baron suddenly, and drew rein. The others stood bewildered. What did he mean to do? He turned to Hans, and his blue eyes shone like steel. "Hans," said he, in his deep voice, "thou hast served me long and truly. Wilt thou, for this one last time, do my bidding?" "Aye," said Hans briefly. "Swear it," said the Baron. "I swear it," said Hans. He drew the sign of the cross upon his heart. "That is good," said Baron grimly. "Then take thou this child, and with the others ride with all the speed that thou canst to St. Michaelsburg. Give the child into the charge of Abbot Otto. Tell him how that I have sworn fealty to the emperor, and what I have gained thereby, my castle burnt, my people slain, and this poor simple child, my only son, mutilated by an enemy." "And thou, my lord Baron?" said Hans. "I will stay here," said the Baron quietly, "and keep back those who follow as long as God will give me grace to do so." A murmur of remonstrance rose among the faithful few who were with him, two of whom were near of kin. But Conrad of Drachenhausen turned fiercely upon them. "How now?" he said. "Have I fallen so low in my troubles that even ye dare to raise your voices against me? By good heaven, I will begin my work here by slaying the first man who dares to raise words against my bidding." Then he turned from them. "Here, Hans," said he, "take the boy, and remember, knave, what thou hast sworn." He pressed Otto close to his breast in one last embrace. "My little child," he murmured, "try not to hate thy father when thou thinkest of him hereafter. Even though he had heard and even though he be hard and bloody, as thou knowest." But with his suffering and weakness, little Otto knew nothing of what was passing. It was only as in a faint flickering dream that he lived in what was down around him. "Farewell, Otto," said the Baron, but Otto's lips only moved faintly in answer. His father kissed him upon either cheek. "Come, Hans," said he hastily, "take him hence," and loosed Otto's arms from around his neck. Hans took Otto upon the saddle in front of him. "Oh, my lord Baron," said he, and then stopped with a gulp and turned his grotesque, twitching face aside. "Go," said Baron harshly. "There is no time to lose in woman's tears. Farewell, Conrad, said his two kinsmen, and coming forward they kissed him, and upon the cheek. And they turned and rode away after Hans, and Baron Conrad was left alone to face his mortal foe. Chapter 13. How Baron Conrad held the bridge. As the last of his followers swept around the curving road and was lost in sight, Baron Conrad gave himself a shake, as though to drive away the thoughts that lay upon him. Then he rode slowly forward to the middle of the bridge, where he wheeled his horse so as to face his coming enemy. He lowered the visor of his helmet and bolted it to its place, and then saw that sword and dagger was loosed in the scabbard, and easy to draw when the need for drawing would arise. Down the steep path from the hill above swept the pursuing horsemen. Down the steep path to the bridge headed, and there drew rein. For in the middle of the narrow way sat the motionless, steel-clad figure upon the great war-horse, with wide, red, panting nostrils and body streaked with sweat and flanked with patches of foam. One side of the roadway of the bridge was guarded by a low stone wall. The other side was naked and upon the bare and open and bare to deep, swelling, moving water beneath. It was a dangerous place to attack a desperate man clad in armor of proof. "Forward!" cried Baron Henry, but not a soul stirred in the answer, and still the ironclad figure sat motionless erect upon the panting horse. "How," cried the Baron Henry, "are ye afraid of one man? Then follow me," and he spurred forward to the bridgehead. But still no one moved in answer, and the Lord of Trutz-Drachen reined back his horse again. He wheeled his horse and glared round upon the stolid faces of his followers, until his eyes seemed fairly to blaze with passion beneath the bars of his visor. Baron Conrad gave a roar of laughter. "How now," he cried, "are ye all afraid of one man? Is there none among ye that dare come forward and meet me? I know thee, Baron Henry. Thou art not afraid to cut off the hand of a little child. Hast thou not known the courage to face the father?" Baron Henry gnashed his teeth with rage as he glared around upon the faces of his men at arms. Suddenly his eyes lit upon one of them. "Ha, Karl Spriegler," he cried. "Thou hast thy crossbow with thee? Shoot me down, yonder dog." "Nay," said he, "thou canst do him no harm under his armor. Shoot the horse upon which he sits." Baron Conrad heard the speech. "Oh, thou coward villain," he cried, "stay, do not shoot the good horse. I will dismount, and fight ye upon foot." Whereupon, armed as he was, he leapt, clashing from his horse, and turned the animal's head, gave it a slap upon the flank. The good horse first trotted and then walked to the further end of the bridge, where it stooped and began cropping at the grass and grew beside the road. "Now then," cried Baron Henry fiercely, "now then, ye cannot fear him, villain. Down with him, forward." Slowly the troops spurred their horses forward upon the bridge and towards that one figure that, grasping tightly the great two-handed sword, stood there alone guarding the passage. Then Baron Conrad whirled the great blade above his head until it caught the sunlight and flashed again. He did not wait for the attack, but when the first of the advancing horsemen had come within a few feet of him, he leapt with a shout upon them. The fellow thrust at him with his lance, and the baron went staggering a few feet back. But instantly he recovered himself, and again leapt forward, the great sword flashing in the air, whistling. It fell, and the nearest man dropped his lance, clattering with a loud, inarticulate cry, grasped the mane of his horse with both hands, and again the blade whistled in the air, and this time it was stained with red. Again it fell, with another shrill cry, and the man toppled headlong beneath the horse's feet. The next instant they were upon him, each striving to strike at the one figure, to ride him down, or to thrust him down with their lances. There was no room now to swing the long blade, but holding the hilt in both hands, Baron Conrad thrust with it as though it were a lance, stabbing a horse or a man, it mattered not. Crowded upon the narrow roadway of the bridge, those who attacked him had not only to guard themselves against the dreadful strokes of their terrible sword, but to keep their wounded horses rearing and mad with fright from toppling bodily over with them into the water beneath. Presently the cry was raised, "Back! Back!" and those nearest the Baron began reining their horses. "Forward!" roared Baron Henry from the midst of the crowd. But in spite of his command, and even the blows that he gave, those behind were borne back by those in front, struggling and shouting, and the bridge was cleared again, excepting for 3 figures that lay motionless upon the roadway, and that one who, with brightness of his armor dimmed and stained, leaned panting against the wall of the bridge. The Baron Henry raged like a madman. Gnashing his teeth together, he rode back a little way, and then turning and crouching his lance, he suddenly clapped spurs in his horse, and the next instant came thundering down upon his solitary enemy. Baron Conrad whirled his sword in the air as he saw the other coming like a thunderbolt upon him. He leapt aside, and the lance passed close to him. As it passed, he struck, and the iron point flew from the shaft of the spur to the blow, and fell clattering upon the stone roadway of the bridge. Baron Henry drew in his horse until it rested upon its haunches, then slowly reined it backward down the bridge, still facing his foe, and still holding the wooden stump of the lance in his hand. At the bridge head he flung it from him. "Another lance?" he cried hoarsely. One was silently reached to him, and he took it in his hand, trembling with rage. Again he rode to a little distance and wheeled his horse, and then driving his steel spurs into its quivering side, he came again, thundering down upon the other. Once more the terrible sword wielded in the air and fell, but this time the lance was snatched to one side, and the blow fell harmlessly. The next instant, and with a twitch of the bridle rein, the horse struck full and fair against the man. Conrad of Drachenhausen was whirled backward and downward, and the cruel iron hoofs clashed over his prostrate body as the horse and man passed with a rush beyond him to the bridge head beyond. A shout went up from those who stood watching. The next moment the prostrate figure rose and staggered blindly to the side of the bridge, and stood leaning against the stone wall. At the further end of the bridge, Baron Henry had wheeled his horse. Once again he crouched, lance in hand, and again he drove down upon his bruised and wounded enemy. This time the lance struck full and fair, and those who watched saw the steel point pierce the iron breastplate and then snap short, leaving the barbed point within the wound. Baron Conrad sunk his knees, and the Roderburg, looming upon his horse above him, unsheathed his sword to finish the work he had begun. Then those who stood looking on saw a wondrous thing happen. The wounded man rose suddenly to his feet, and before his enemy could strike, he leapt with a great and bitter cry of agony and despair upon him as he sat in the saddle above. Henry of Trutz-Drachen grasped at the horse's mane, but the attack was so fierce, so sudden, and so unexpected that before he could save himself, he was dragged to one side and fell crashing to his armor upon the stone roadway of the bridge. "The dragon! The dragon!" roared Conrad in a voice of thunder, and with the energy of despair he dragged his prostrate foe towards the open side of the bridge. "Forward!" cried the chief of the Trutz-Drachen men, and down they rode upon the struggling knights to the rescue of their master. in this new danger. But they were too late. There was a pause at the edge of the bridge, for Baron Henry had gained his feet, and stunned and bewildered as he was by the suddenness of his fall, he was now struggling fiercely, desperately. For a moment they stood, swaying backwards and forwards, clasped in one another's arms, the blood from the wounded man's breast staining the armor of both. The moment passed, and then, with a shower of stone and mortar from beneath their iron-shod heels, they toppled and fell. There was a thunderous splash in the water below, and as the men-at-arms came hurrying up and peered with awe-struck faces over the parapet of the bridge, they saw the whirling eddies sweep down in the current of the stream, a few bubbles rise to the surface of the water, and then nothing, for the smooth river flowed onward as silently as ever. Presently a loud voice burst through the awed hush that followed. It came from William of Roderburg, Baron Henry's kinsman. "Forward!" he cried. A murmur of voices from the others were all the answer that he received. "Forward!" cried the young man again. "The boy and those with him are not so far away, but that we might yet catch upon with them." Then one of the men spoke up in answer, a man with a seamed, weather-beaten face and crisp, grizzled hair. "Nay," said he, "our Lord Baron is gone, and this is no quarrel of ours. Here before of us, and that are wounded, the three I misdoubt that are dead. Why should we follow further only to suffer more blows for no gain?" A growl of assent rose from those that stood round, and William of Roderburg saw that nothing more was to be done by the Trutstraken that day. Chapter 14. How Otto saw the great emperor. Through the weakness and sickness and faint, Otto had lain in a half-swoon through all that long journey under the hot May sun. It was as if a dreadful nightmare that he had heard on and on and on the monotonous throbbing of galloping hoofs upon the ground, and felt that last kiss that his father had given him upon his cheek. Then the onward ride again, until all faded away in a dull mist, and he knew no more. When next he woke, it was with a pungent smell of burned vinegar with his nostrils, and with the feeling of a cool napkin bathing his brow. He opened his eyes and then closed them again, thinking he must have been in a dream, for he lay with his old room at the peaceful monastery of the White Cross on the hill, and the good Father Abbot sat near by, gazing upon his face with the old absent student look. Brother John sat in the deep window seat, also gazing at him, and Brother Theodore and the leech of the monastery sat beside him, bathing his head. Beside these old familiar faces were the faces of those who had been with him in that long flight, the one-eyed Hans, old Master Nicholas his kinsman, and the others. So he closed his eyes, thinking that maybe it was all a dream, but the sharp throbbing of the poor stump at his wrist soon taught him that he was still awake. "Am I then really home in St. Michaelsburg again?" he murmured, without unclosing his eyes. Brother Theodore began snuffing through his nose, and there was a pause. "Yes," said the old abbot at last, his gentle voice trembling as he spoke. "Yes, my dear little child, thou art back again in thine own home. Thou hast been long out in the great world, but truly thou hast had a sharp and bitter trial of it. But they will not take away But they will not take me away again, will they? Said Otto quickly, unclosing his blue eyes. Nay, said the abbot gently, not until thou art healed in body and art ready and willing to go. 3 months and more have passed, and Otto was well again, and now, escorted by one-eyed Hans and those faithful few who clung to Baron Conrad through his last few bitter days, he was riding into a quaint old town of Nurnberg, for the Emperor Rudolph was there at that time, waiting for King Ottokar of Bohemia to come hither and answer the imperial summons before the council, and Otto was travelling to the court. As they rode in through the gate of the town, Otto looked up at the high peaked houses with their overhanging gables, and like of which he had never seen before, and he stared with his round blue eyes at seeing them so crowded together along the length of the street. But most of all he wondered at the number of people that passed hither and thither, jostling each other in their hurry, and at the tradesmen's booths opening upon the street, with the wonderful wares hanging within, armor at the smiths, glittering ornaments at the goldsmiths, and rich fabrics of silks and satins at the mercers. He had never seen anything so rich and grand in all his life, for little Otto had never been in a town before. "Oh, look," he cried, "at the wonderful lady! See, Holy Father! Sure the Emperor's wife can be no finer than that lady." The abbot smiled. "Nay, Otto," said he, "that is but a burgher's wife or daughter. The ladies at the Emperor's court are far grander than such as she." "So," said Otto, and then fell silent in wonder. And now at last the great moment had come when little Otto, with his own eyes, was to behold the mighty emperor who ruled over all the powerful kingdoms of Germany and Austria and Italy and Bohemia, the other kingdoms and principalities and states. His heart beat so that he could hardly speak, as, for a moment, the good abbot, who held him by the hand, stopped outside and a rasped doorway to whisper some last instructions in his ear, and then they entered the apartment. It was a long stone-paved room. The floor was covered with rich rugs, and the walls were hung with woven tapestries, wherein were depicted knights and ladies, and leafy gardens, and kings and warriors in battle. A long row of high glazed windows extended along the length of the apartment, flooding it with the mellow light of autumn day. At the further end of the room, far away, and standing by a great carved chimney place wherein smouldered the remains of a fire, stood a group of nobles in gorgeous dress of velvet and silks, with glittering golden chains hung about their necks. One figure stood alone in front of the great yawning fireplace. His hands were clasped behind him, and his look bent thoughtfully upon the floor. He was dressed only in a simple gray robe, without ornament or adornment. A plain leathern belt girded his waist, and from it hung a sword with a bone hilt encased in a brown leathern scabbard. A noble stag hound lay close behind him, curled up upon the floor, basking in the grateful warmth of the fire. As the father abbot and Otto drew near, he raised his head and looked at him. It was a plain, homely face that Otto saw, with wrinkled forehead and a long mouth drawn down at the corners. It was the face of a good, honest burgher burdened with cares of a prosperous trade. Who can he be? Thought Otto, and why do the poor men stand there among all the great nobles? But the abbot walked straight up to him and knelt upon the floor, and the little Otto, full of wonder, did the same. It was the great Emperor Rudolph. "Who have we here?" said the emperor, as he bent his brow upon the abbot and the boy. "Sir," said Abbot Otto, "we have humbly brought you by petition in the name of your late vassal, Baron Conrad of Rolf of Drachenhausen, for justice to his son, the Baron Otto, whom, sire, as you may see, hath been cruelly mutilated at the hands of Baron Henry of Roderburg of Trutstrachen. He hath moreover been despoiled of his lands and his castle, burnt, his household made prisoner." The emperor frowned until the shaggy eyebrows nearly hid the keen gray twinkle of the eyes beneath. "Yes," said he, "I do remember me of that petition, and have given it consideration both in private and in council." He turned to the group of listening nobles. "Look," said he, "at this little child marred by the inhumanity and the cruelty of those robber villains. By heavens, I will put down their lawless rapine, if I have to give every castle from the north to the south to the flames and to the sword." Then turning to Otto again, "Poor little child," said he, "thy wrongs shall be righted, and so far as they are able, those cruel Roderburgs shall pay these pennies for pennies, and gain for gain, and what thou hast lost, and until such indemnity hath been paid, the family of the man who wrought this deed shall be held as surety." Little Otto looked up in the kind, rugged face above him. "Nay, Lord Emperor," said he, in his quaint, quiet way, "there are but two in the family, the mother and daughter, and I have promised to marry the little girl when she and I are old enough. So, if you please, I would not have harm come upon her." The emperor continued to look down at the kneeling boy, and at last he gave a short, dry laugh. "So be it," said he. Thy plan is not without its wisdom. Mayhaps it is all for the best that the affair should be ended thus peacefully. The estate of the Rodbergs shall be held in trust for thee until thou art come of age. Otherwise it shall be as thou hast proposed. The little maiden shall be taken into the ward under our own care. And as to thee, art thou willing that I should take thee under my own charge in the room of thy father who is dead?" "Aye," said Otto simply, "I am willing, for it seems to me that thou art a good man." The nobles who stood near smiled at the boy's speech. As for the emperor, he laughed outright. "I give thee thanks, my lord baron," said he. "There is no one in all my court who has paid me a greater courtesy than thee." So comes the end of our tale, but perhaps you may like to know what happens afterward, for no one cares to leave the thread of a story without tying a knot in it. 8 years had passed, and Otto grew up to manhood in the emperor's court, and was with him through a war and peace. But he himself never drew a sword or struck a blow, for the right hand that hung at his side was of pure silver, and the hard, cold fingers never closed. Folks called him Otto of the Silver Hand. But perhaps there was another reason that for the name that had been given him, for the pure, simple wisdom that the old monks of White Cross on the hill had taught him, clung to him through all the honors that the emperor bestowed upon his favorite. As he grew older, his words were listened to and weighed by those who were high in council, and even by the emperor himself. And now for the end of all. One day Otto stood uncertainly at the doorway of a room in the imperial castle, hesitating before he entered, and yet there was nothing so very dreadful within, only a poor girl, whose heart fluttered more than his. Poor little Pauline, whom he had not seen since that last day in the black cell at Trutstraken. At last he pushed aside the hanging and entered the room. She was sitting upon a rude bench beside the window, looking at him out of the great dark eyes she had. He stooped short and stood for a moment confused and silent, for he had not thought in his mind but of the little girl whom he had last seen. For a moment he stood confused before the fair maiden with great beautiful dark eyes. She on her part beheld a tall slender youth with curly golden hair, one hand white and delicate, and the other pure and shining silver. He came to her and took her hand and set his lips upon it, and all that she could do was to gaze with her great dark eyes upon the hero whom she had heard so many talk, the favorite of the emperor, the wise young Otto of the silver hand. The end. Afterward, the ruins of Drachenhausen were rebuilt, for the walls were there as sound as ever, though empty and gaping to the sky. But it was no longer the den of robber baron, for beneath the scutcheon over the great gate was carved a new motto for the wolves, a motto which the Emperor Rudolph himself had given: "A silver hand is better than an iron hand."